everyone, and welcome back to another week of Tuesday Times Roundtable. TTR is the Office of Global Learning Initiative's flagship discussion series that brings together multiple perspectives on current global issues and trends. As we engage throughout the session, we ask that we please use the microphone so that we can hear and learn from everyone's perspective, especially today because we have two panelists joining us via Zoom online who are going to appear here on the screen next to me. They will not be able to hear anything that isn't spoken directly into a mic. So as to today, especially because we have Zoom participants, we ask that we please respectfully use the microphones when we do that. So again, my name is Michelle Zaldivar. Welcome to TTR. If you haven't already, the QR code is your sign-in. It's posted around the room and will still be open by the end of the session. But if you have a chance to do that now, that would be great. As always, TTR, which is brought to us by the New York Times, is tied to a New York Times article. To read today's article, you can go to go.fiu.edu/TTR1004. That's today's date, 1004. To read today's article that informs our session, The Changing Internet, Education Equity in Web3. If you get to that go.fiu.edu/TTR1004 and you hit a paywall, I got you. Because as part of a member of the FIU community, we all have a free digital subscription to the New York Times. So if you haven't already, you should absolutely activate your New York Times subscription. You can do that at accessnyt.com and make sure to use your @fiu.edu email to sign in with those credentials. A couple of announcements just before we get started. We are hosting a double session tomorrow of GL Info because we are rescheduling last week's hurricane canceled session. Our first session tomorrow at 1 p.m. is going to focus specifically on the scholarship opportunities that applications are open right now. They are the Bob Farrell Global Learning Scholarship for Sustainable Development Projects and the Rupert Lynn Global Learning Scholarship for students going after their capstones for the going after their capstones for the Global Learning Medallion. We'll do a specific info session at 1 p.m. on both of those scholarship opportunities. You can join us at go.fiu.edu/GLinfo. Additionally, at 6 p.m., we'll have a second info session on our general programs. So if I'm talking about a capstone and a Global Learning Medallion, and you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, our main student-facing programming is the Excellence in Global Learning Medallion. We also have other programs, including PC Prep and the Millennium Fellowship, that our office, the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, sponsors and develops that programming. And you can learn all about those tomorrow at 6 p.m. at go.fiu.edu/GLinfo. Last announcement, we have another special session of TTR coming up soon. On October 26th, we'll have a special all-online TTR at 11 a.m. That's going to be the continuation of our Russian invasion of Ukraine series. This is specifically student voices from Western Ukraine, where we'll invite a group of students living currently in Western Ukraine to talk about their lived experiences and what that means for their continued education. So again, that's Wednesday, October 26th, 11 a.m. That will be fully online. You can register at go.fiu.edu/Ukraine. And finally, today's very special session on the Changing Internet, Education Equity in Web3, we have Dr. Emily Anderson, who is working as an assistant professor of international and intercultural education here at FIU. Her research investigates girls' education and women's work and is published widely in academic journals and books. You can check out her current research project on Instagram at Cardstock Project. I feel like there's a .com after that. There's not. It's just a handle. It's an Instagram handle, at Cardstock Project. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Anderson to go ahead and introduce our panelists for the day as well.
Yay! It's real now, right? We've got feedback. It's so great to see all of you. Hi, as Michelle so kindly introduced, my name is Emily Anderson, and I'm an assistant professor of international and intercultural education in the Department of Educational Policy Studies over in CASE. So Where are the ed folks in the room? Who's studying education? Give me a hand. Couple folks, awesome, awesome. And so this is a conversation that's going to expand, right, on what we know, what we think about education, but we're going to think about it in a particular way. And drawing from the expertise of two of my favorite people in the whole world who frankly know a lot more about what we're going to be talking about today than I do. And so before we get into introducing our panelists and to talk about the sort of what our goal is for today, we are, pardon me one moment, we're going to talk a little bit first about what Web3 is. And so how many of you have heard this thing called Web3? Just give me a show of hands. Kinda, a little bit, yeah? So by the show of hands, I have like this, right? So for those of you who have heard of Web3, where have you heard about it? So for those of you who kind of went like this, where's been some places you've heard that? Yes, sir. In relation to blockchain, right? Okay, so we've got this idea that Web3 is somehow connected to blockchain, so we know crypto is part of that, right? What other spaces have we heard Web3 being discussed? Right? It's sort of this thing that exists that we kind of hear about a little, but we don't sort of have a full understanding of what it is. And so we're going to sort of test to see what we think it is. On the screen is a QR code. I invite you to scan it with your phone, and it's going to take you to a survey that I'm going to actually share the results with you after at the end of our talk today to sort of see how we think about Web3 and why it might matter. And so you'll see that in the slides, or you'll see that in the survey, there's a couple different options, right? What's one option that it gives you to define Web3? For those of you who are in there already, I think you'll see some things that have already been noticed. What do you see? Crypto, 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 right? And so that to this colleague's point before, blockchain and crypto, we sort of hear that a lot with Web3. What are the other options that you see? My favorite is Facebook as a mall on the internet, which is how I first heard about Web3, was that Mark Zuckerberg is going to build us a mall, right? That somehow it's going to change the way that we think about commerce. It's going to change the way that we think about money, about how we use it. But the one that's most interesting to me is not that question. What is the one that is most interesting to you? I want to see how we match on that list. Yes? Versus the one we have. Yeah, absolutely. So that was the after figuring out that maybe Facebook is Meta's trying to make us a mall, that's where it took me, was thinking, oh my gosh, is Web3 an opportunity to imagine the internet that we want versus the one that we have? And so the article that our Tuesday Times Roundtable today sort of discusses or plays around with is that history, right? It goes through sort of thinking about Web 1, Web 2, what those things are, and then this idea of Web 3. And so Web 3 is going to be the context of our conversation today. And we're really going to think about it exactly to that point of what might it mean for us to have the internet that we want versus the internet that we have. And so to contextualize that a little bit, I want to draw in a quote that's from the article. And please, if you have a chance to read it, I think it's a really good primer on Web3, at least what we know now, knowing that nobody knows what it is, right? Because it's a thing that's emerging, it's evolving. How many of you, just as a quick aside, were here 2 weeks ago for Dr. Maria Lovett's wonderful Tuesday Times Roundtable focusing on the work of Bob Moses? Awesome. And so you know that one of the things that Bob Moses and his work has done, right, is that it asked us to imagine a future that doesn't exist, right? It asked us to imagine what justice might look like for all children in the United States. It asked us to think about the responsibility of our Constitution, right, to ensure that education equity is available to every person in the United States, right? And we could have that conversation, as many in my field do, thinking about why that matters outside the US. And so we're going to kind of play in that imagination space, right, inspired by Dr. Moses's work, to imagine something that does not yet exist, as a way to problematize some things that do actually exist right now in real time when we're thinking about education equity. So now we've thought a little bit about Web3, knowing that it means a lot of things and nothing, right, all at one time, which is the coolest thing to think about. Let's draw on this quote from the article that says, the next generation of innovations, collectively known as Web3, is about tilting the scales of power and ownership back towards creators and users. Wow. Just kind of think about that for a minute. And as you're thinking, give me a show of hands. How many of you have an Instagram account? Raise one. How many of you have Instagram and Facebook? Give them up, okay. Keep your one hand up if you got Instagram. All right, so Facebook, no, maybe we got two hands. How many can throw TikTok in there? Who's TikTok and maybe a little bit, okay. All right, we're running, we'll have to do feet, right? How many of you had a MySpace? There, yep, me too. I'm an elder millennial, I think is what y'all, the youth, are referring to me at this point. And so you've all participated in this idea of Web 2. Right? When we think about Web 2 as a space that's really about the platform. And so user experience is determined by the platform that we're using to create and to innovate using technology, particularly information and communication technologies, ICT. But we know that, where's my MySpace folk again? We got like a handful? Okay, cool. So we know that MySpace is outmoded, right? And so MySpace sort of became what? Facebook, and Facebook kind of shifted to what? Instagram, and Instagram kind of shifted to what? TikTok, right? And so we see the evolution of these technologies in real time. And so Web 3, in contrast to Web 2, is thinking about decentralized autonomous ownership. And so the idea of DAO is something that you're going to be hearing a lot about in this session, but also in a future Tuesday Times Roundtable that is going to talk about Web 3 in a little bit of a different way. So in thinking about this quote, we're really going to focus on this idea of innovation and innovation within education. And so anytime we're thinking about innovation, we have an opportunity to consider what works well and what could work better. And so the work that I do as a scholar is really interested in girls' education and the relationship between what happens when girls go to school and then what happens when they turn into women, when they grow into women and they go to work. So my research is cross-national, it's international and comparative, which means that I think about the stocks and flows of things, right? So how schooling in one place of the world affects schooling in another place of the world. And so there's a couple of things, even though that research is very diverse, right? When we think about contextualizing it in place and in time and within culture. But there's a couple of things that we know when we think about education, and we involve girls and women as populations of interest. Is that girls go to school longer than any other gendered identity group, period. Go to school longer, they persist longer, and they receive more, they complete at a greater rate. So that greater rate of completion scales from elementary school in the way we think about it in the US, so a K-5. It goes up until lower secondary school, so that's our junior or middle school. And we see it start to dip in some places around the world when we look at upper secondary, so our high school experiences and then to college. And so there are some differences when we look at the data, cross-nationally comparative. But the trends are interesting because they are so similar. We also see that despite girls and women's increased educational opportunity, well, I'll say that differently, increased education access for girls and women. Just take a beat there. What's the difference between access and opportunity? Who can tell me that? Yes, thank you.
You couldn't have an opportunity without access in general, and it kind of opens the girl's agency to access, like we're saying, the resources to be able to kind of start that.
Absolutely, thank you. And so when we think about access, it's like, is there a school for me to go and can I go there? Right? And so there's lots of things we consider in the literature when we're considering access. We're thinking about transportation, we're thinking about school facilities, we're thinking about teacher quality, we're thinking about curriculum, right? All of those are access points. But it doesn't really, an access argument is really most interested, as one of my research collaborators shared with me many years ago. An an access-focused approach to girls' education only focuses on butts and seats. That's the quote. It doesn't focus on everything else that happens. Once you're there, that's opportunity, right? So we're thinking about not only access to education, but opportunity in and through education, and the ways in which Web3 might provide us a space to innovate to address some of those challenges that remain despite girls' and women's advancement in getting lots of degrees, spending a lot of time in school, and then et cetera, et cetera. So that's a small piece of the literature that I would love to go further in, but for our purposes today, we're really gonna think about it in terms of the ways that Web3 might provide a space to think about equity differently, specifically for Black women. And so my colleagues that I'd be very happy to introduce now, I'm gonna go back a little bit, are the folks that have way more expertise in this than I do. I study the internet. I kind of don't mess around too much with it. And we'll talk maybe about that why in the Q&A. But I'm very blessed to be in collaboration and community with two fantastic women who I'll introduce now that have really been engaged as innovators in the Web2 space. And because they had that expertise by building brands, building companies, building media, they have a lot to share with us about how education can assist or can provide other options or other opportunities for Black women and women of color within Web3. And so I'd love to first introduce wonderful colleague, Eboné Almon. And so Eboné is the host of the Professional Homegirl podcast. How many of you are listeners? Anybody heard PHG? Well, you're going to in a minute, and you're gonna love it. And so she is the host of the PHG podcast and also creator of the Professional Homegirl coloring book. She's an entrepreneur with a passion for storytelling that's inspired her to create a platform where women of color don't have to look far to see themselves. I feel like we should just take a beat there, right? And so Eboné is a powerful force in podcasting and using her voice to amplify other women. So not only they will be seen, but most importantly heard. And so let's give a round of applause to welcome Eboné. Yay. And so we're going to come back to Eboné in a second. I would like to now introduce our other conversation partner for today, a woman who is very near and dear to my heart and my work. Kendra Neely is the founder and the creative director of Sincerely Creative Enterprises. She's a multidisciplinary creative and storyteller, and Kendra is passionate about fusing culture, innovation, and storytelling together to create and activate brands with substance and soul. And so all the brands under the Sincerely Creative Enterprise serve solo entrepreneurs, and corporations in various design capacities, including branding, marketing, public relations, and project management, and also event production and web design. And so let's give Kendra a round of applause. So glad that she's here. And so I'll also be a bit transparent and tell you that Kendra is one of my creative partners. In 2000, we started a project to really think about scaling some ideas I had as a researcher to bring them into this Web3 space. And so Kendra is not only a dear colleague, but also someone who is very, very, those of you who have taken my classes and know about Rep Her, Kendra is 1/3 of Rep Her. So glad to have you both in conversation. And so now I'm going to take us to a question that we were really thinking a lot about in bringing together the ideas of innovation in Web3 and educational equity, particularly focused on women of color creators. And so we came together in conversation, and we developed this question together through rounds of discussion about, what do we know about Web3? What don't we know about it? And then creating that space to really imagine what the internet that we want might be, given the internet that we have, and why that makes sense, or why that might make sense for how we think about education equity. And so the question we asked ourselves to talk about together and invite you to talk about with us today is, how can Web3 accelerate equitable higher education opportunities for women of color and from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds? And so this is the question that we're really going to spend our time this afternoon kind of deliberating together. But first, I'm going to turn it to Eboné Almon, the professional homegirl, to talk about her coming to to this question. So Eboné, please share your thoughts. So good to have you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Emily, for including me in this amazing conversation. I will try to keep my passion at a minimum. But when I think about this question, for me, I think it's important that we get to the root of it. And being someone that worked in the tech industry for over 2 years, I think about how there's less than 8% of Black professionals within this industry, alone less than 2% of Black women within this industry. And when I was working in the tech industry, I noticed that there were hardly any people of color, let alone women of color, in these leadership positions. So how can we promote education and digital equity where that small 8%, I'm pretty sure, don't have any power, are not partaking in campaign creation, and also don't have access to these resources or funding resources. And also, I also think about within the education equity, how can we promote expansion where there's not any exposure? And where a lack of exposure, how can we have any fairness, and how can we promote more producers within this inclusive community, or within this, what's the word they're using, digital utopia, when a lot of people, including myself or people who look like me, never even heard of Web3. So I think it's important that we hold these companies accountable and urge them to provide more educational resources along with funding, because that's how we're going to all be a part of this inclusive community that they're trying to build or would like to see come.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your comments. And you really helped us to think about, again, linking the idea of creators with agency, with ownership. And so if we go back to some of the things that at least we're talking about, or that the internet is trying to talk about in terms of Web3, it's really about changing the game in terms of who owns what. And so instead of the content that you all create, saw lots of Instagram folks, lots of TikTok folks, right? In terms of the content you create, do you own it?
Right.
Right? Like, who owns it? And so then who has the right to it? Who then can monetize it? And those are all things that creators like Eboné and like Kendra are grappling with in their work. And so Kendra, I invite you into the conversation to build on Eboné's points, and also to help us think about this idea of acceleration, which I know is something that's really important and close to your work.
So thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here. This is, like you said, something that is very close to my work, but also something that I'm very passionate about. I'm a MySpacer. I still use my Tumblr faithfully. So there's a lot of elements when I think about creation from 2000 to now that have really could have been being monetized by creators for years. But in terms of education equity, I thought about this a little bit more this morning, and I went back to what it really looks like for women of color, or women that identify as women of color that come from low-income communities. And I thought about what Bank of America, Wells Fargo, a lot of these financial institutions, including fintech institutions, are actually doing now to invite us into the spaces of small business funding, venture capital. And while those numbers are also incredibly low, it's devastating. I thought about what that meant for Web3 and how Web3 is continuing. It's like butter, it's continuing to churn, right? While we're just being invited into these spaces, and we're just starting to be invited. So I can't even say that we're fully being invited, because I think that those things are still being scoped out and mapped out in terms of what that actually looks like. But I often wonder when we look at curriculum, how we can go back and start at the root of the problem, right? I think a lot about disparities and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I know you and Eboné and I talked about that, and I look at basic needs, right? Are our basic needs being met? And if they aren't being met, for those of us who, like myself, have come from low-income communities, it's very difficult to focus on any type of innovation when you're solely trying to survive. So when I think about institutions in higher education, I think it really goes back to making sure that there are opportunities to solve those basic needs, right, at a foundational level, and then also incorporating some sort of financial literacy programs and rethinking what financial literacy looks like and in terms of education at coming in super new, and not just thinking about it in with credit, because credit is of course very important, but there's also this whole identity of Web3, right? And we don't often think about Web3 in terms of an asset, but it is. And many of you, I'm sure, that are sitting in this room are content creators. And some of you might consider yourselves content creators, and some of you might not even be thinking of it like that. But if you have a niche, or you have a skill, and you have something that you can teach people, you can create content, you can create courses, you can create subscriptions based from Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, you name it, you can create that. And you don't necessarily solely own that content. That content belongs to the platforms that you're on. So when we think about financial literacy, how are we thinking about that as an asset? And I think that those are things that we can start to, from an education level anyway, start to think about how do we teach these things now, so we're not getting left out of the conversations that are going to continue to happen, and we're not left behind.
Such great points. I wanted us to think a little bit together about this idea of equity and inclusion. And so those are sort of buzzwords that folks hear, you know? And so I think that one of the things that's happening in the literature as well is that people talk about inclusion in lots of different ways. Equity, thrown around a lot, but it has a pretty easy definition, right? What's the difference between equity and equality? I'll prime it. Go for it. Absolutely. So one more time, loud and proud.
So equity is trying to level the playing field, giving everyone what they need to be on the same level. Meanwhile, equality is giving everyone the same thing regardless of where they are.
Absolutely. And so for those of you who have the opportunity to take Dr. Courtney Rose's class, she does a great, she's one of our dear colleagues in EPS, does a great conversation around the difference between equity and equality. And exactly to your point, it's thinking about giving folks what they need in order for it to be fair, right? So you think about fairness versus sameness. The same argument is applied to the earlier example I gave you about butts and seats, right? And so we can think about an equality approach to gender mainstreaming is one of the ways it's talked about in the field, where we just want to make sure that girls are in school, right? But there's a lot, as we know, that happens after we have those butts and seats that gets us into that conversation about fairness, right? Of equity of opportunity. And so one of the things that my colleagues and I, Eboné and Kendra, have talked about a lot is what equity of opportunity look like, right? What does it feel like to be in an educational space where you feel that you are on equal footing with the folks around you? So one of the ways that Web3 is really interesting to us is that it's providing at least a conversation space to think about the ideas that Kendra just noted for us, that maybe it's about harnessing individuals' creativity, innovation, entrepreneurial isms, right? Starting doing your own thing because you say you can, right? And not necessarily because someone else tells you you have permission. And that really matters when we think about how we show up on the internet. And so I alluded before that I study the internet, I don't really mess around with it too much. And there's one of the reasons for that is that as the elder millennial that I consider myself named to be, is that I was coming out of undergrad. Where are my undergrads in the room? Show me. All right. Yay. And so I was coming out of undergrad, I was going to be a social studies teacher. I was a social studies teacher. And the rule when I was student teaching was don't be on Facebook. Don't do anything on Facebook. Lord knows, don't have fun and put it on Facebook. Because it was at the time, we're going back, right? It was at about 2005. We're going back where principals, when I was looking for teaching jobs, would actually pull people's Facebooks and MySpace to sort of vet them. And that just really freaked me out. And so I said, all right, well, I guess this is not a space for me. And so the way I was introduced to Facebook, frankly, was because one of my best friends did her master's degree at a university that required students to have a Facebook account. And so she was like, oh, it's cool, you should do it. You could like meet people. Meanwhile, I'm scared, I'm like, I'm never gonna get a job. So I did not mess with Facebook for many years until I got married. And the only reason was because all my girls were like, if you don't put these pictures on Facebook so we can all see them, we're done. So peer pressure. But I really avoided it for a long time, as well as I avoided Twitter. And for academics, there's this very outmoded idea of no Twitter until tenure. And so, yeah, I know, right? I know. But it shows you, like, with the evolution of the internet, it's also evolved the way we think about work, right? It's evolved the way we think about using these tools in a way that not only creates and innovates and builds community, but also creates a space for your personal brand. I know that that's kind of problematic language for lots of reasons, but that, to me, as an academic, was like, oh, that's not for me. So you know what I did? I nerded it up and I studied it. And so I thought about it I thought about how girls' education discourses are, framed and diffused through Instagram. I thought about how international development organizations use Twitter to frame agendas. So I was still in it, but it wasn't me, right? And so for some reason, right, for those reasons and more, I knew that the internet was not a safe place for me. Yet, plenty of women all over the world use the internet, particularly social media, as the subaltern space to build community, to create things that don't exist, and to fill gaps that serve particular community needs. And so I want to turn back to our conversation partners for today to share a little bit about what your journeys were to figuring out that being engaged as a creator and an innovator in Web 2 was available to you, and how did you find and make your space? Because both of our colleagues on the screen have built communities that span not only numbers of people, but continents of people. And so that's really interesting. For me, thinking that the only way I do that is because I'll become a professor, right? And then I'll just be nerdy, I'll think about my things, I'll write them down, I'll talk to people about them, and that was enough for me. Until Web3, without a personal space, right? Without your personal brand, it's kind of hard to introduce yourself, right, in the world without those things. And so, turning back to our colleagues, how did you make sense of that in your own work? Creating spaces that didn't exist in order for your art and your passion to flourish and to build community. And so, Eboné, I'll start with you if that's okay.
So, I'm thinking about the question, and I started the professional homegirl maybe almost 4 years ago. And, I never heard of podcasting. I never heard of a lot of things. But one thing I can say about myself is, I'm very resourceful. And I feel like everything that I need is either within me or within reach. So my journey in the beginning, I don't think it was difficult, but I do think that if I had access to certain resources that could have helped me alleviate some of those issues that I did come across as far as building community, knowing which apps to use to help me find my people, I think that it would have been a lot easier. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier about exposure helps expansion, because if I was exposed to certain things and privy to certain things that my other colleagues were, I think it would have been a lot easier. And I probably would have got to where I'm at a lot faster if I had those opportunities or those resources within my reach.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about equity, it's about resources, and using resources differently is something that Kendra and I have been thinking about a lot through our creative work over the last couple of years. And Kendra, if you can share a little bit too about what you created, a space that has been a resource, right, to folks in ways that I honestly think it's like starting from scratch. And so as I shared, Kendra and I have been working together for a while. And so even me agreeing to be on video has taken what, like 2 years, a little bit less, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I can't be out here on the internet, right? And so Kendra works with other academics too to kind of break us out of this like, oh, the internet is not a safe place for us, but also to think about it as a place that can be a resource, right, for other women through our work in particular to find each other who might not find each other otherwise. So Kendra, if you can share a little bit too about what resources mean for you and what equity of access, or equity of opportunity looks like in the spaces in which you work.
I think a lot about forging the path ahead in terms of resources. When I started to build my own personal brand, it was a lot of me really just looking to find my people. I want to say this is my junior year of undergrad. So a lot of it was me understanding. I had already surveyed the land and I was very clear on, okay, this is the type of identity that I want to have post undergrad. And my people are on the internet. At that time, Instagram was moving, but it was nowhere near what it is today. You didn't have all the capabilities that you have today. So I knew that if I built my community and I showed up as authentically as I possibly could, and I was transparent that that community was that was a relationship that I was ultimately going to have to nurture. And then I started to identify with other businesses and specifically small businesses and other like academics, speakers, that they needed to do the exact same thing to expand their reach. Resources, however, were already a problem because and in the beginning it was okay to have a computer, and so long as your computer had a camera, you were good to go. As these apps developed, resources needed more resources. So that might have meant a microphone, that might have meant a tripod, a ring light, and all of these other things started to come along with having better content to further expand your reach. I don't think that today there is a place where we talk openly and honestly about those things. And I think that it's really important to kind of go back to content creation and what that looks like by industry and by profession. So when we think about academics specifically, and we think about the types of information that you're working on and you're trying to share and get out there, if it's only just for your students, that's cool, but you can continue to build upon your personal brand and also your research if you're getting online and you're building that network and building that community of people, and then coming together and using those resources interchangeably, and collaboratively. So going back to the original question, I think resources for me present day they are within my community. Eboné is a resource and a friend within my community, and I hope that she would consider me one in hers as well. And I thank you. And those relationships those mean so much to me, because at the end of the day, one hand scratches one, however it goes, but we help each other out. We look out for each other. And those are my resources that are digital anyway, that help me further expand my businesses, my clients' businesses, and then of course my partners.
And just to add on to what Kendra is saying, I do think it's important that we are being our full authentic selves, because I think that with the communities that we have, including myself, like I speak to so many different women from many different walks of life. I think that this gives them hope that they too can exist in their full self in any digital world, whether it's Web2, Web3, or God knows how long it's going to keep going. So I do think that it's important that, we share these resources between each other, because I know for me, a lot of things were not easy for me to have. And I go back to what Kendra was saying earlier about, coming from certain neighborhoods, and, a lot of people can't even partake in these conversations because they're too busy worrying about basic survivor needs. Just now, if I'm not mistaken, they are offering free internet services if you hit within a certain bracket, money bracket or tax bracket, whatever. So, and I think that speaks volumes. Like, a lot of Americans cannot afford internet. So I think that it's important for us to have these conversations and promote these things and provide these resources, because that's the only way that we're going to have equity in anything.
I think it's important to also know, to your point, Eboné, we are Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's like something that I'm fixated on. So I'm going to keep like mentioning that. But I think it needs some modifications to present day, and I think that having internet access, right, is so critical to not just education, but people's livelihoods, right? So how do we start to look at that and solve that foundationally before we go any further in web 2 or web 3, because there's a lot of people that are still being left out. There's content creators now that are sitting in areas that don't have 4G, 5G, whatever. They don't have the right access, but they're trying their best, but they're unable to produce the types of content that people who have stellar internet access, who have all the tools and the resources, when in fact, if they had those same resources, they might be in better financial situations.
Or for those people who do have, let's say, minimal resources or opportunities, and they create these amazing trends, but they don't have the opportunities or resources to put it out there even more compared to other counterparts who take their ideas and make way more money off of it. So it's just how is it fairness across the board?
Absolutely. So the idea of fairness across the board, is so important when we're thinking too about what education, particularly higher education institutions, can do to maximize resources, but also really be mindful of the change, right? That at least in conversation is happening around Web3. And so interestingly too, when we were talking at the start of our time together today, I asked, who had heard of Web3. So a couple people were like, yeah, maybe, we think it's crypto, and we think it's, and it is for sure. But the only places I was hearing Web3 being discussed were not with my university colleagues. They were with my creative collaborators. And so there's a disconnect, right? When you think about the knowledge and resources that is carried and built within university systems, and its ability or not to reach out and to build those bridges and partnerships that have a lot to do with why we have not only access challenges, but also, for our conversation today, equity issues that exist and persist. And so I'll turn it back to our colleagues for some final thoughts, and then I would love to hear your questions and ideas for our colleagues as we close up today around what do you think is important for professors, for administrators, for students within higher education to understand about the opportunities that Web3 might provide, and what we can do differently to make sure that we can find each other more simply, maybe? Or more, that we can have access to each other, right? That we can find our people, to your point. So Kendra, if you would like to start us off.
I think it goes back to really rethinking curriculum and not being afraid to think of curriculum in a way that it hasn't been thought of before. Looking at curriculum holistically, what that means on a socioeconomic level, on an emotional level, and then looking towards ingenuity and innovation and how we can fuse all of those things together to really create tools and systems and plans for education that invite everyone into the room and solve those problems, those needs, right, that have to be met in order to give everyone a fair chance. So I would say at the minimum, courage, because that's a lot. You have to be very brave to be able to stand up and say that, hey, this is a problem. And I think this is a problem, and the tools that we already have might be a good starting point, but we're going to have to look at this from a really different lens and take some time out and really survey the student population and ask them what their needs are that aren't being met, and then fuse that with what is happening in Web 2 and Web 3 to be able to prepare them for the future. And
Eboné, I think you have the last word on this question. What can higher education, or can or should higher education be thinking about around ideas concerning Web3 and equity?
Pretty much feel like Kendra summed everything up, but on top of just the curriculum, on top of, definitely having the courage, because I know it's not easy being the only one, or being a very few small selected group of people to speak out on having equity in the digital world. But I think most importantly, funding and holding people accountable. We need money, we need resources to provide these tools so people can have resources to everything, or educational resources so they can have opportunities in this new digital utopia, because I feel like without the funding and the educational resources, we might as well just keep things the way it is.
Right, so we have to think about really what the change is and the changes that we're willing to make to really think about equity differently. So as a way to invite conversation, I'm going to ask everybody if you got a little green sticky. If you don't have one, please pass forward. If you need one, I can help you with that. And so we're going to do a little bit of a raffle as another way to thank you for your great participation today. And so if you will be so kind to write your name and your preferred email address, we're going to draw some names out of a bag, because Eboné has been so gracious in offering the professional Homegirl coloring book, which is, like, frankly, the coolest thing I think that exists in the world, to a very lucky person in the room. So get in the raffle, go ahead and write your name and your preferred email address there, and we're going to go around and collect them while we're having an opportunity to ask our panelists and myself, if you'd like to, about what this work means for us moving forward, or questions that you were thinking about as you were listening to what it means to be a creator and an innovator in this weird transition space between Web 2 and Web 3. So questions, comments, ahas, what can we share? And remember too, there are mics coming around, so make sure you get your great ideas loud and proud so that we can have them for the recording. Yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you guys so much. It was very interesting. I hadn't really thought about education like this before, but I wanted to ask, I'm not sure if it was addressed, I don't know if I missed it, but for people that are low income, like I know during the pandemic, there's a significant people are kind of put back a lot more than people that had access to technology and people who didn't, because everything was on Zoom, all these online assignments. So how do you get people to have access to, a laptop, technology, the internet, if that's the way that you see, to help them? That's the way you want to help them.
Oh, that's such a great question. So we're thinking a lot about, like, not only resources, but not resources sort of broadly, but tools, right? When you need actual tools to be online and to create content, to participate in these spaces. And so I'll throw that question to our panelists. What do you think?
I think that falls back on that becomes the responsibility of the institution, whether it's education or the workplace. If people need to succeed, and it's ultimately a requirement, then those needs have to be met. We have to look at what do needs mean now, not what they meant before. So making sure that people have those tools, and finding, to Eboné's point, finding the funding, that it has to come from somewhere, finding the funding to make sure that those needs are met, then that's what has to be done. But it can't be, I know students, for example, in one of the areas that I live and that I mentor, and that these students, they don't have computers in their home. Having a computer in your home in 2022 is a necessity. But how do you expect a single mom of 4 who is making $40,000 or less per year to afford a decent computer that serves children who are all in secondary school or elementary school? It doesn't make sense. So I think the responsibility first and foremost falls on the institution to make sure that those needs are met.
And also, just to piggyback off what you're saying, Kendra, it just comes down to process of elimination. What's more important? A lot of people can't even afford childcare.
Yeah.
I can't afford childcare, which I need my kids to be looked after, why would I be thinking about buying a computer? So I think it's important that these institutions provide people with the tools that they need, which is a laptop, which is maybe a phone, which is a portable internet device, like something where people will be able to learn and be able to do their job fully.
And these are some of these things are these are in certain areas are programs that are funded at the federal level and at the state level, but they are not being rolled out at the speeds in which that they need to be rolled out in order for these children to be successful and to catch up with the students who already have these things before things continue to move on. And as we know in Web2 and in Web3, it's not stopping. It's a train, and it's just continuing to forge ahead. So making sure that these programs are not being held up and they're removing the red tape and the barriers to entry are essential to the success of these students and their families.
And also making sure that people know about the programs.
that too. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. That's a barrier to entry is having access to the information. And I think we oftentimes, specifically in education, we're real quick to want to turn on the test scores and send out the notices to the school districts and come for the teachers in the low income areas. But have we given them all the tools to succeed? No, we haven't. So those needs have to be met before we're pointing fingers and making any types of assumptions.
Right.
Yeah, so many assumptions, right? And so your question, thank you again, is so well timed because it helps us to think too about before we can think about leveling the playing field, we need to get everybody on the field, right? And so if we're thinking about access to tools matters. And it matters so that we can sort of say, okay, we're here, right? We've got this basic operating sort of level, but because access is more about what happens opportunity is more about what happens in the process. It's also important that we think about what goes past the tool, right? What goes past the tool to think about different kinds of relational and other competencies that folks are presumably going to need differently when we move into this Web3 space. And so regardless of the field from which we orient our work or ourselves, that this is not changing. And so, well, actually, it is changing, right? But our ability to distance ourselves from the change is going to continue to be harder and harder. Again, I'll use myself as an example. I was very able to not be about the internet for a really long time. That is not the case for me anymore, right? And so you, as creators, as scientists, as educators, as thinkers, as innovators, those aren't necessarily choices that you will be able to make in the same way that I was, because it's not an option, right, anymore in the ways that it was generationally. And so as a way to invite future conversation, I will say thank you so much to our panelists first. Let's give them some love, round of applause. And in a moment, I'm going to draw a very lucky name from the bag and connect you directly with Eboné so that you can receive your complimentary raffle copy of the Professional Homegirl coloring book. And there's also opportunities for you to connect with Kendra's work. Their Instagram information is available for you both in these slides, and we want to invite you to a follow-up conversation that we will be having once the YouTube of this talk goes live. And so a couple ways that you can connect with us to do that. So one, the Professional Homegirl on Instagram, right? And Kendra is Ken_in_the_city. Again, I'll make sure that everybody has access to their information. And two, if you want to keep in touch with me around the research that I'm doing sort of in this weird Web 2, Web 3 transition, you're welcome to join us at Cardstock Project on Instagram that we are very excited to be able to be launching today. Yay! And so Before we get to our final goodbyes, I want to invite you to some giveaways that are on the table. So you'll see that there are a couple of cardstock kits that you're welcome to take. They're free if you want to participate in the research. There's a QR code on the bag that you can scan to learn a little bit more about the project. I'd just like to give a little bit of a shout out to Yuli and to Anna, who have participated as collaborators in this project, and it's so wonderful to be able to launch it with colleagues afar and here. So there's also some notebooks on the table that you're welcome to take. Those are free. And without further ado, the lucky person, the second edition of the coloring book just came out and I'm obsessed. Also there's stickers, is Angela. Woo! All right, Angela, coming at you. So, thank you again for a great conversation. So lovely to spend time with you. Keep thinking about these ideas, and check us out online for our follow-up conversation on this question and more. Thanks again for coming. Thank you to TTR for all of your wonderful support, and to Michelle specifically as our host. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Eboné and Kendra. We'll see you on the internet.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. One more round of applause for Dr. Emily Anderson. And if you'd like to join us again next week, we have a different kind of extension of the blockchain technology. We'll be talking about crypto this time, so crypto, right? Next week we have the College of Business professor Tassos Maiordis, who's going to be talking about the growth risks and attitudes surrounding cryptocurrency companies working with legislatures to be able to produce their own oversight rules and regulations. So that's going to be a really interesting conversation if you want to continue this about the technology and blockchain and Web3. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to hang out, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.